Good afternoon. Welcome to our very last study, our lesson 4 in the book of Esther for such a time as this. Now, just real quick, going over the timeline again so we can get chapter 8 in context. The events of chapter 1, verse 1, through the beginning of chapter 3, we see 9 years has happened. The events of the rest of chapters 3 through 7 only took a very, very few days. And then the events of chapter 8 through 10 were a few months after chapter 7. So now we are getting to the end. We are getting very close to ground zero, to the day of the great pogrom, the 13th day of Adar. And we're going to start in chapter 8, and we see this phrase, on that day. Well, what day? On what day? It's not an arbitrary day. This is the day that Haman was hanged and killed. So Esther disclosed to the king, finally, after Haman was dead, what her relationship was to Mordecai, that she was indeed his cousin. So finally, after all of these years, the king knows that his wife is a Jew. And not only that, but he realizes that her people, or the people that this pogrom is aimed at, are the Jewish people in his kingdom and all 127 provinces. So the king took his ring, his signet ring, and he gave it to Mordecai, which was very symbolic of the king giving Mordecai his authority. He gave Haman's house to Esther, which meant everything he had, the land, the house, the servants, the money, everything that the man owned now belonged to Esther. That would have been a lot. Remember, Haman was second only to the king. He had vast, vast riches. And so Esther, in turn, gave it to Mordecai and put Mordecai in charge of all of it. Then something very curious happens in verse 7 of chapter 8. The king makes an odd statement. The king says that Haman was hanged because he threatened the Jews. When did the king find out that the threat was actually against the Jews? He didn't find out till after Haman was dead. So why, when we look at the end of chapter 7, was Haman actually hanged? He was hanged because the king thought he was assaulting the queen. It had nothing to do with the fact that the Jews, that he had plotted against the Jews. He didn't even know the people group until after the man was dead. So I'm not real sure where the king got that idea from, but, he still says Haman was hanged because he threatened the Jews. So then Esther wept, pleaded, begged the king to prevent Haman's plan. I mean, hadn't Mordecai just been promoted and Esther given vast amounts of riches? Well, yeah. But like we saw last week, a change in position didn't change anybody's circumstances. It didn't change Esther's, and it most surely did not change Mordecai's. In chapter 8, verse 5, and in chapter 9, 13, we see that phrase again, pleased the king. But also in chapter 8, verse 5, who else do we finally see that was pleased? The Jewish people. But the problem was the king couldn't revoke the edict, not even for the queen. And neither could Mordecai, even with the king's signet ring. All injunctions and statutes and ordinance signed by the king or given his signet ring, because he didn't write the edict against the Jews to begin with. Remember, Haman did. They couldn't be revoked according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. And we see that in Daniel chapter 6, verses 8, 12, and 15. But the king wanted to correct the situation. He didn't want the Jewish people to be wiped out and all of his provinces. He didn't want that at all. Now, whether it was because he had a love for the Jewish people or because he really had a love for Esther, we don't know. But even if it was just because he loved Esther and he had just elevated or promoted Mordecai, doesn't really matter, because any action he took to save them was going to save the entire Jewish population. So he allowed Esther and Mordecai, remember, has his signet ring, to write to the Jews whatever they wanted and seal it with the ring. So they called in the scribes on the 23rd day of the 3rd month. So we have about 9 months now for this to get out to all 120 provinces so that the Jewish people could arm themselves. Now, scripture also specifically mentions that it was not just to be sent to the Jews in Hebrew, but it was also to be sent to all the leaders and all the people in all the provinces. So that maybe the leaders could talk to the people, and the people could talk to the people, and the people could talk to the leaders, and the Jews could talk to everybody, and they could just sort of come to a peaceful understanding that you're not going to kill us, that you're just not going to do it. So it was written in the language of the Jews and in everyone else's language, and it gave the Jews the right to do 4 things. It gave them a right to assemble, to everybody come together. It gave them a right to defend their lives. It gave them the right to destroy, kill, and annihilate the entire army of any people or any province which might attack them. And they were even allowed to kill the women and children. And then lastly, the 4th thing, it gave the Jews the right to plunder all the spoil and to take it for themselves. So how did the people react to this decree? Well, when Mordecai went out in royal robes and a big crowd, I mean, the city of Susa, it says, shouted for joy. I mean, way back in chapter 3, verse 15, when the first decree went out and Haman and the king were just sitting back in Susa drinking it up, thinking, everything was fine and dandy, everyone was thrown into horrific confusion. But now there's this light, this gladness, this joy and honor for the Jews. As a matter of fact, the day this went out, they made it a feast and a holiday for Jews in every province. So here we have a holiday just because they were actually given the chance to defend themselves. Not that they wouldn't die, not that some of them wouldn't, but at least they were given a chance to live. Many actually, it says, became Jews because of their fear and their dread of the Jews. And we see this dread in chapter 8, verse 17. We see it again in chapter 9, verse 2 and 3. So what exactly does it mean to become a Jew? You had lots of cross references in your homework. And it mentions that any servants that are bought from other nations by a Jewish person had to be circumcised, just like the Jews were, because God's covenant is in their flesh. So they had to become part of covenant people, even though they were not national Jews. Shabbat, Sabbath, had to be held holy by those from other nations who even visited Israel. They didn't even have to live there, but if they visited Israel and a Shabbat came, it had to be kept holy, because you weren't going to be unholy in God's city. They, along with any slaves, the people who were visiting or the slaves who lived there, could celebrate Pesach, Passover, like the natives of the land, like the regular Jewish people, if they were circumcised, because you have to be part of the covenant in order to celebrate the feast, in order to even understand what they're about. So the same laws applied to all of them. Whether you were a native Jew, whether you were a slave, whether you were born in Israel, whether you were just visiting, whether you moved there and you were an immigrant, it didn't matter. God's laws applied to everyone who was in the land where God chose to put his name. Now, chapter 9, bum, 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 is the day that will live in Jewish infamy. It's the 13th of Adar. We're now 9 months after chapter 8. This is the day that Haman wanted to destroy the Jews. And this is the day that God, through Esther and Mordecai, was going to save them. So the Jews assembled together against anyone who tried to harm them. And it says nobody could. I mean, it didn't matter how, how many people, how strong their army was. Nobody could stand against the Jewish people. And do you remember who else couldn't stand against the Jew Mordecai? Haman. So his wife Zeresh not only prophesied that Haman would be overcome, but now who do we see being overcome? Everybody who decided it would be a smart idea to go against them. Now, I don't know if these people still thought that they were going to get 10,000 talents for trying to harm and for going against the Jews, but I have something to tell you, folks. You aren't getting paid. You're going to pay with your life and with the spoils of the plunder, but you're not going to get any money for this. The Jews just in Susa killed 500 men and Haman's 10 sons in Susa. Now, when that happened in Susa, Esther actually requested an extra day, the 14th of Adar, so that the Jews in Susa could continue to defend themselves and so that Haman's sons could be hanged. On that extra day, that 14th day of Adar, because the king was like, go for it. He wasn't going to stand up against the Jews. They were a pretty mighty army. They killed 300 more people. The people in the other provinces actually spent the 14th fasting and rejoicing. Their fight was over. But the Jews in Susa, because they had that extra day, they had to fight for 2 days in Susa. They actually feasted and rejoiced on the 15th. And in one day, in these other provinces outside of Susa, 75,000 were killed. This is historically incredible. That King Xerxes, who at the time would have been the most powerful man in the world, in the known world, allowed captives to legally invade his country and kill 75,810 citizens. And the Jews never saw a dime. Because in verse 10 and in verse 15, we are told they did not take plunder. It was theirs to take. They had every right, but they did not take it. Their lives were enough. So at the end of those 2 days, the 13th and 14th of Adar, Mordecai recorded all the events that happened. He sent letters out that declared the 14th and the 15th of Adar to be a holiday, that you would feast and rejoice and send gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And he called these days Purim, which is plural for the the dice that Haman actually rolled to determine when they were going to be annihilated. And this feast was to be for not only the Jews, but the descendants and all those who allied themselves, all those people who decided to become a Jew. This was also for them. It is still celebrated to this very day by giving food to your friends and gifts of money and gifts of clothing or whatever they need to the poor. And that's called your Zedekiah. It's acts of righteousness. In 2024, this year, it's the evening of March the 23rd to the evening of March the 24th. So that's 1 day. Remember, days are counted from sundown to sundown. They have a lunar calendar and not sunup to sunup the way we count, which we go by a solar calendar. Jerusalem, however, will celebrate something called Shushan Purim from the evening of the 24th to the evening of the 25th. That's still just 1 day. Shushan is the Hebrew word for Susa. So if you live in Jerusalem or in a walled city, then Purim is the 15th of Adar, or Shushan Purim, because Esther asked for that extra day, the 14th, and we're told in scripture that they celebrated and feasted and rejoiced on the 15th. So Esther and Mordecai wrote to confirm the second letter, wrote them words of great peace, and wrote to establish the Feast of Purim with instructions for their times of fasting and lamentations. And God gave the Jews a great, at that time, worldwide victory over their enemies. Now, the author of Esther could have stopped right there, and the story would have been completely finished. I mean, great victory. This is an amazing, amazing set of scripture. I love the book of Esther. But he didn't stop there. He took the last chapter to really focus on Mordecai. Talked about his authority and his strength, that Mordecai vision, the chosen from looking at his circumstances and letting him circumstances dictate his feelings and his actions. Instead, he had that Mordecai vision, that looking for the face of God in humility, humbly looking for the face of God with mourning and fasting and sackcloth and ashes to get beyond the circumstances. So the king advanced him to greatness, to high honor. He was second only to the king. He replaced Haman. So he was great among the Jews and had great favor with many of his kinsmen. Why? Why would he be made so great? He sat at the gate. We've only heard, a very small conversation that he had with Esther, that the king never heard, never recorded in his chronicles. So why? Why was he elevated? Why was he promoted? Why was he honored for his authority and his strength? And why was he great? For two reasons. One, he sought the good of his people. And two, he spoke up for the welfare of his entire nation. Believe it or not, this ends our study of Esther. But I want to know, and you can just put them in the comments down below this video, through the lives of Haman and Mordecai and Esther, how has God spoken to you? Because application is everything. Has God pointed out some area of your life where you have Haman vision, where you look at your circumstances and it enrages you and you're angry and you try to take everything into your own hands? Or has God really shown you where you need to have Mordecai vision, where you need to look beyond your circumstances and beyond your feelings and stop letting them dictate your actions and your thoughts and your feelings, and instead you approach God humbly, maybe with fasting, maybe not, with prayer, seeking his face and his guidance and finding joy in the circumstance? Has he spoken to you through the life of Esther? Has he shown you these why me, God, kind of questions? And has he shown you for such a time as this? What have you learned about God? Even though he's behind the scenes and not mentioned one time, what have you learned about God and about his hand? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. I'd love you to share. So until next time, when we begin our study of the Book of Lamentations, I bid you all Shalom Aleichem, peace to all of you, Shavua Tov, have a great week, and I will see you next time. Shalom.